Okay, here we go. Okay. Hi, my name is Wendy Maruchek, and I'm the president of the Issaquah High PTSA. And we are delighted to have Sally Fouché with us. Thank you so much, Sally. And we're so glad that all of you can join us this afternoon. Just a couple of housekeeping things. This session is being recorded and will be available on the PTSA website. So just go ahead and if you could keep your video off and your audio off, unless you're invited to turn them on, that would be great. Otherwise, we're going to see your nice faces on this video that's online. And we will assume that you've given us permission to show your faces online. If you have any questions, you can type them in chat. The chat bar is at the bottom of your screen, the very bottom. And if you've already submitted questions, we will go over those during this session, or you can just type them in chat as well. That's fine. I just want to mention that we do have a website, issaquahhighptsa.org, and we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. If you have any questions, there's our email address right there, ihptsapresidents@gmail.com. Let me go ahead and switch. And today we have Sally with us. Thank you, Sally. Her presentation, her 2-hour presentation is on her website at that address on the slide. And she also has handouts there as well. And we just want to thank Sally for coming. And we want to thank Tracy Kinsley for being our chair of our college and career planning. And we want to thank our VPs of programs, Victoria Evans and Wendy Cummins. So it's all yours, Sally.
Okay, well, I'm just going to join in the thank yous for a brief minute. It's been my real great delight to work with Issaquah High for, I don't know, 3 years maybe now, and I've gotten to know Wendy and Victoria and the other Wendy a little bit. You guys are super lucky to have them. And when I'm actually leaving the college consulting business, or whatever you call this, but when the pandemic and quarantine hit, I was like, oh my gosh, all those families who haven't been able to go to information sessions. So I'm happy to be able to provide a little bit. And if any of you made it all the way through my 2-hour presentation, I mean, you should get like a prize. That's a lot of video watching to do, but I wanted to be as thorough as possible. So I'm happy to answer any questions today. I do have a few starter questions, so I'll start with those. This wasn't a question that any of you submitted, but I bet it's a question all of you have, which is about standardized testing, both SAT and ACT testing. And this is a giant question always around the college admission world, but coming up for your students, this is going to be an even bigger question. And a couple things that I know is, number one, things are changing rapidly. I looked up some information yesterday and I looked it up again this morning, and even between last night and this morning, something's changed. So what I know to be true today is, for example, now, as of today, all Ivy League colleges have said that they will not be requiring SAT or ACT testing for admissions. However, strangely, if you're an Ivy League recruited athlete, you'll still need to take the tests. I expect that may change. So surrounding testing, my best guess option or idea for you is, if your student has already taken a test, if they're a rising senior and they've already taken a test and they're happy with those scores, go ahead and submit that with your college application. If you haven't found a testing site or your student isn't happy with their test scores, don't panic about that. This is an opportunity to apply without the stress that comes with getting that testing sorted out. What schools have said about this, so for many, many years, a number of schools have been test optional. And the reason for that is most schools who follow these trends don't believe that test scores are very predictive of college success, meaning a top standardized SAT or ACT score does not guarantee a successful college student, and vice versa. So there is some experience in the admissions world with this. And in fact, an article from, I think it's last week, talks about Whitman, which has been test optional for a number of years, And on average, about a quarter of the students who apply to Whitman do not submit test scores. And Whitman has some pretty stringent admission requirements, so they are comfortable that they're able to evaluate students and just admit a successful student body without those test scores. So you're welcome to ask more specific questions about that, but I thought I would address that as we're waiting for some questions to come in too. And type something if I've not been clear about that. It's hard to be clear, honestly, because it's changing every day. One last thing I'll say about that is if you have a rising freshman or sophomore, we don't know how long this optional status will exist. A couple of schools have already said testing will be optional for the next 2 years worth of applicants because they know this affects not only rising seniors but rising juniors. So you're just going to have to stay tuned for that. That's pretty tough thing to predict. I'm going to turn and address a couple other questions that came in the preceding days. Someone asked about financial aid, and there's always a lot of questions around financial aid because, college costs a pile of money. And there is a section on my video and presentation about that. But this specific question was around sort of COVID and pandemic times as more families have been experiencing furloughs and layoffs and possible unemployment. Oh, you can't hear. Someone says they can't hear. Wendy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Just want to make sure. I saw somebody who couldn't. So regarding change in employment status during your application for financial aid with your college student. So what you do is the day you apply, which can be anywhere between, let me correct that, the day you apply for financial aid, which those forms can be begun to be filled out October 1st. It looks at income from the prior year. So it's going to look at your income status from a year and a half ago, essentially. And you would have had a job then in this particular circumstance. But there is a box on the financial aid application, the FAFSA application, as well as the CSS profile. Those are two financial aid applications. There are boxes there for extenuating circumstances. And you would want to share there, since this tax information, I have now been laid off. My family income has changed. Colleges are used to managing this because this happens not infrequently. And in fact, it can happen during the 4 years that your student is in college. So for the person who asked that question, when you put the data in, it might not match what your current situation is. Just be sure to clarify that. And you can always follow up with a phone call too. This is going to be a common experience that colleges are dealing with. I'll turn to another question, couple of questions. What does it take to get admitted to an Ivy League school? And there are a couple questions about this. And one of the partner questions was how many AP classes to get admitted to an Ivy League school. I want to use the term, instead of Ivy League school, let's talk about what I term in my presentation, the lottery reach schools. So these are schools whose admission rates are under 12 or 10%. So they only admit anywhere between 4 and 12% of their applicants. We would call those, in my vernacular, a lottery reach school. And what does it take to get admitted to those schools? Wow. I mean, in some regards, who knows? Because it is a little bit subjective. In essence, you're going to have a really, really, really strong transcript. That means really great grades, but also rigorous classes. So if your GPA is a 4.0, but you have not taken advantage of any AP courses offered at your school, that would not be considered rigorous enough, probably, for an Ivy League school or a top tier school. And in general, what the really competitive schools are looking for is true intellectual curiosity and commitment and passion about something. And it doesn't have to be one particular thing, but if you're able to demonstrate that, let's take the example of the quarantine time, that even without the rigorous grading of a normal school year, you pursued a research project because you're very interested in the history of the Berlin Wall, and so you did some work on that during the time of COVID. Like, that kind of intellectual curiosity and passion is one of the things that those top tier schools would be looking for. I'm not sure if that really is a full answer, except to say, I'll repeat what I always say is, build a nice college list, give yourself options. Don't just apply to those top tier schools, because nobody really knows exactly precisely what it takes to get admitted to those schools. Vague answer, I know. The partner, it's hard to know if everybody's, without seeing people, if that is making sense. So Wendy, please interrupt if I need to slow down or correct what I'm saying. A partner question to that was, how many AP classes should a student take if they are applying to a top tier school? Again, this is a very hard question to answer, but this leads to a couple of things. As I mentioned, if you are at a school like Issaquah High School, which offers a number of AP classes, and you've not taken any of them, that would say to a admissions officer, this student might be afraid of taking a little academic risk. They only want to take classes where they're assured of top grades. They don't want to challenge themselves and risk pushing themselves. And top tier schools want students that will take academic risks, that will push themselves, that will take a chance on, you know, maybe not getting that top grade. So schools will look at the rigor of a transcript, and AP scores are one measure of that. I would say in general terms, the students that I've seen be successful to being admitted to top tier schools have, let's say, between 4 and 5 AP classes in junior year and in senior year. But that's not true across the board. That's just a rough generalization. It is definitely not good for students to be so overwhelmed with schoolwork that it compromises their ability to do well generally. So that's a good question for, for one of your guidance counselors as well. I'm going to show a little, partnered with this. There's something called, I don't know, does that show up reversed? Probably does. This is the Issaquah High School profile. And if you Google that, Issaquah High School profile, the word profile, you'll see what colleges learn about Issaquah High School. And this is where they learn, this goes with every single application to every single college when a student submits that. This is where they learn how many AP classes Issaquah High School students are offered. This is where they learn that percentages of students at Issaquah who take AP classes, and also, it just so happens on the Issaquah profile, information shared includes some averages about GPAs for graduating classes. That's not true of every high school, but you can learn what a college knows about Issaquah High School. So they do think about you in context. Oh, good, Wendy, you're good at typing while I'm talking. So that was those two questions. Do we want to answer any of the chat questions before I move on to these pre-submitted questions?
There was one chat question, and it was, what would you consider a good enough test score that's worth submitting if testing is optional?
Yeah, Rooney, that's a really tough question to answer, because it really depends on the school. So here's a good way to determine that, is if you look in a college guidebook, like this one, the Fisk Guide to Colleges, or the Princeton Guidebook, or even online at some of the search tools, they will show you the range of scores from admitted classes at that particular college. And they're going to report, and this was in my video, I won't repeat too much of it, they're going to show you the middle 50, which is the scores of the students in the middle 50%. What were their average scores? What was that, those score profiles? So if your student is right in that middle 50 or above, then that's a good score to submit for that particular college. If your students' scores are in the lower quadrant, the lower 25th percentile, or below that middle 50, it doesn't mean you shouldn't apply, but it means that that school is going to be tougher for you to get into. And whether you want to apply to that school, test optional and just leave off your scores, that is going to be a new, broader based option thanks to COVID. So I would recommend that you look for each school in one of these sources. It's pretty easy to see what the scores are there. And the other great, very quick tool for that is on a link to on my website too. It's called Mark Moody's Quick and Dirty College List. And he also has a quick summary of these books and what test scores might be good for which schools. So let's see, I'll jump to one of these other pre-submitted questions. Given that it is possible that a number of college freshmen are going to defer this next year, this question is about that. With many 2020 grads deferring enrollment, what is going to be the impact on the 2021 acceptance rate? Wow, I don't know. And colleges have no idea either. The colleges are trying to manage those deferments. Some schools are not allowing deferments, and some are. And so a bunch of those kids will be part of the 2021 starting freshman class, which potentially could mean there are fewer seats for those students who graduate high school next year. And unfortunately, I think colleges just don't have a handle on those numbers yet. It can happen all the way up until the end of August or September before they'll know who's actually attending college in the fall. So I'm sorry I can't answer that question, but it is something to ask at a college visit. You could ask an individual college, are you going to increase the number of students you admit, or will there be fewer spots? One of the considerations a college might have is housing and how many students they can house. That could affect the number of admissions. They may have to reduce some class sizes to accommodate distanced housing. But let's all hope that by the time your students, if you have rising seniors, that by the time they graduate, we will all be vaccinated and it'll just be a wonderful world. So we'll hope for that. When did you want is there another question, or should I'll try, I have another pre-submitted. Pardon?
You can keep going. That's
okay.
Fine. I haven't seen any others. Just for the people who've just joined us, Sally has a webinar, or she put together a session. It's on her website at sallyfouché.com, and I'll type it in the chat box. And so this session is just a question and answer session. Maybe something was unclear, or maybe you'd like her to expand on something. You can just type it in chat, and she will be here till 5 o'clock. Great, thank you, Sally.
Happy to answer whatever. Here's another question. It's a really great question. How do we set our children up for success who are going to Issaquah High School this coming fall? I will just say what I kind of think. You know, I have 3 children of my own who've been to high school, none of them during COVID times, although I do have a college senior who graduated this year. And then I worked in the counseling office for, I don't know, 6-7 years, and then in college advising. And what things make a student successful? One thing your students have already done is learn about resilience. And your kids, none of us wanted them to learn resilience this way, but I will say it's pretty interesting. I'm going to really be interested in the study of this generation moving forward in terms of their ability to flow with change. And so I do think there's some great skills already built. The other thing in terms of success for next year, one of the, for separate activity of mine is I've been doing some studying of what's happened with students during the pandemic and how they reacted to especially online learning as well as grade. I'm not sure what Issaquah did about grades. Wendy, could you refresh me on that? This ties in with my answer. Did students, how did grading happen in the end for Issaquah High School students?
For this past semester?
Correct.
It was, you could have, they would take the highest of 1 of 3 grades. I believe it was either the midterm grade, the end of the semester grade. There was one more grade in there, I think right before we took the break. They will choose whichever is the highest. You cannot fail a course, but you can get a D.
Okay. Well, in speaking to that and speaking what happened in the Bellevue School District is you either got an A in a class or you got an incomplete. And, you know, I will loop myself into this. Education has spent many decades teaching children how to respond to grades, teaching high school students how to be grade responsive. And one of the things I think that you can be a successful student next year is to really not be as grade responsive about what you are doing and learning in your classes. And this is really easy for an adult to say. I know it's hard for a student to continue to be enthusiastic and learn even if their grade isn't dependent on it. But I do think that's something that we should prepare students for next semester, because who knows what next semester is going to look like. There may be some more online learning, and what are the ways you can continue to feel some level of commitment and excitement about your classes. And you know, those are big questions, whether that takes a parent being on a student's, you know, hey, did you forget to do, don't forget to do. It's hard to know how to set students up to be excited and enthusiastic about a class, but they're just gonna, that time investment will really pay off in terms of how their application to a college comes across, because you can write about your enthusiasm for learning when it's genuine. And you can write about that in your college essay if it's truly genuine, that you're really excited about a specific particular subject and that you continued being excited about that. So that's one thing in terms of setting you up for success. I think that might be pretty important. I'll let Wendy pipe in if she has any other how to be successful at Issaquah. She's had 2 students successfully graduate from Issaquah High School, so you may have a couple other things. One more thing to add after you pipe in, Wendy.
Oops. I don't have anything to pipe in right there, but there is
Okay.
Another question.
I see, yeah.
If there isn't a uniform way of grading across the U.S. during online learning time, how do the kids compete for college? Do they have to include a different essay around this?
Again, a great question, because colleges really have used standardized testing to attempt to apply a level, compare Issaquah High School to high school in Boise, Idaho. Standardized testing has been one method for them to do that. And without standardized testing, this question says, how will I know that a student from Issaquah High School with this, let's say, GPA is the same as this student from Boise in terms of ability and capacity? And colleges have a couple of tools in their toolkit for this. One is that they keep massive databases on US high schools, especially the high schools in their region. So for example, University of Washington has a massive database on students from all the area high schools, and they have ways of calibrating students from different schools. And some of this they do with, let's call it an algorithm. I don't know if it's quite that sophisticated, And some of this they do by looking at the transcript and recalculating the GPA. I touch on this a little bit in my presentation. For example, most US colleges drop out PE grades when they're recalculating GPAs. Some, but not all, drop out, so exclude arts grades, but not all. Most US colleges, if you've taken an AP or an IB course, they'll give a little numeric jump to those courses, and they come out with a recalculated GPA, and this helps them to some degree to compare high schools across the country. There are many high schools that don't offer any AP exams, for example, so that's a little bit hard to do, but they do have methods in their tool belt for doing that. And some of it is going to be a little bit more of a guessing game this next year. I will say that, speaking of education broadly, not just your specific students, but it's going to be a really, really interesting experiment for US education to see what happens, which students are successful in college when they haven't used these previous metrics. There may be some exciting and wonderful outcomes from that. I don't know if that's too rosy of a picture. Issaquah High School, I see the question there, does not weight GPAs. I know that Issaquah does not weight GPAs, but colleges do an internal calculation of their own. And they know which high schools are weighting GPAs and which are not. That happens to be part of the school profile that high schools submit. So colleges know that information when they recalculate the GPAs, if that makes sense there. Is that... Yes, you're right, Victoria. The profiles are going to be updated, and most transcripts are going to show, I kind of thought this was hilarious when I first heard that my daughter's college was doing this, but it makes sense. The transcript is going to say pandemic and then the grade, because students might apply to college or grad school many years from now, so they want to make sure that people remember 2020 is the year of the pandemic. So transcripts will probably have that word on it also. And yes, high schools will be upgrading their grading policies, because they have been quite different across the country, what high schools did with that. The previous question, when asking about that, touched on that, on college essays. I'll speak to that just a little bit. So college essays have always been important to small colleges. Small colleges, let's say under 10,000, small and medium-sized colleges, their admissions offices have the bandwidth to read and evaluate college essays. And then more larger schools joined in that too, hired more staff. For example, college essays are very, very important at the University of Washington. What you write in your essay matters a lot, and they do look at and read all of those. Some other really large college systems perhaps didn't read all the essays. If you didn't meet a certain minimum criteria, they might not have even read your essay before they decided to not admit a student. But in coming years, especially next year, the essay will, because test scores might be optional, that's one thing pulled out. The essay potentially will play a larger role. It's hard to know if it'll be larger or just the same as it has been. And many students will probably write about something about the COVID experience, maybe some small component of their essay. Maybe you had time to do that deep dive into horticulture by starting your own garden or whatever. Or maybe you just realized, and I'm speaking like I'm a high school kid now, maybe you just realized, you know what, it was awesome to not be so frenetic. I had time to listen to the thoughts in my head. You know, maybe that'll come out in an essay, or that's a long way away for most of you listening, because it will be at least next summer before your student will have to write an essay. But I don't know if that answered that question. I have one last question here that was in the pre-submitted questions, and I'm going to ask for Wendy and or Victoria's help with this question. What should underclassmen, 9th through 10th graders, oh, I actually have two more. What should 9th or 10th graders be doing in this process? Forever, what I've answered for this question is the same thing I'm going to say now. Focus on doing well in school. That is the most important thing, and it's always been the most important thing. It's always carried more weight than testing. But for 9th and 10th graders, you know, focus on doing well in your classes. Don't let remote learning lead you into more procrastination, which makes it hard to keep up your school momentum. I know as a lifelong procrastinator how easy it is to do that. So that's probably the most important thing they can do, is really just focus on your schoolwork. You don't have to worry about testing as a 9th or a 10th grader, especially now. I've never loved that 9th and 10th graders took the SAT or the ACT. They really didn't have all the content yet, and I think it made them super anxious. But now for a 9th or a 10th grader, there is really no point in trying to find a testing site for ACT or SAT in the next school year. I wouldn't be surprised if they won't even let students of that grade sign up for the slots when they do become available because of the capacity problems. So just focus on your schooling. And, you know, maybe you think about this is true for probably, well, anyway, focus on your schooling. I'm going to ask Wendy or Victoria if they have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's fantastic about focusing on your schooling. It's too early if you start talking to your freshmen about colleges, they will be so burned out by the time they actually have to write the essay, by the time they actually have to look at colleges. So don't start the process too soon. I mean, you can look up stuff if you as a parent want to do a little your own investigating, but don't overwhelm your kids. That's my opinion.
Oh, Wendy, I'm so glad you brought that up. That is so important. I saw in the counseling office so many kids whose parents took them on college visits as 9th graders and had them reading college books, and really they were over it by the time they were juniors and they could hardly get enthusiastic. So there are some rare students who want to look at that information when they're in 10th grade. If they bring it up, that's fine. But I wouldn't start laying college books around when they're 9th and 10th graders. I wouldn't start talking about the process, because honestly, especially coming from a counseling office, this really leads to a lot of potentially mental health problems for young people. The pressure they feel to be turned into, I am only my grade, I'm only my transcript, I'm only what college I can get into. There's a real danger in doing that, and I think collectively us as the adult community contribute to that by talking too early and too often about this information. So I would absolutely agree with that. Victoria, did you have anything on that point to add? I don't know if she's still. Oh. Yes, well, this is perfect timing, Victoria. Victoria types in, encourage kids to think about expanding their various interests. And this is the last question that I have on the pre-submitted questions was, what about community service and volunteer time? How does that affect college admissions, and where can a student or a parent look for those opportunities? So in the state of Washington, students are required to do some volunteer work to graduate. I think there were some waivers issued this year around that. But as far as I know, that will still be a requirement for graduation. So kids will still do some volunteer work. But this is an area where a student can really start learning a lot about themselves and also developing kind of a personal passion, potentially, is in their volunteer time. Colleges often say that 10 or 15 clubs or activities is not that wonderful and meaningful to them. It doesn't show depth of interest, which is one of the things colleges are looking for. So if you were, let's say you're passionate about civil rights and racism right now, and there are many of our students who are feeling very passionate about that right now, that could be their one and only focus for volunteer efforts. And maybe they start a book club among their peers that is reading some of the book lists that are out, or maybe they start a podcast listening club. And I'm not saying you have to start any of these things to be successful, but that might look more interesting to colleges than the student who was president of 5 clubs and also, you know, did 5 or 6 memberships in other clubs. Sometimes, and there are students for whom that is a legitimate passion, but sometimes a long list of activities looks like you did it specifically for your college application, and it doesn't come across as genuine. And by now I've read well over 1,000 college essays and looked at well over 1,000 lists of activities of students. And when, like an admissions officer, when you have that range of experience, you can start detecting sincerity pretty easily. And you can start sussing out those who are just building a list and those who have some legitimate interest in a specific area. So I would really recommend, in terms of volunteer activities or community service, that you try to find something that's of interest to you. Hard to do. Look, these guys, look, they're under 18. I mean, I had really no idea what interested me then. To be honest, I have no idea what all those things mean for me today. It's a lifelong journey. A couple places to look for volunteer activities. If you Google Issaquah volunteer community, Issaquah volunteer opportunities, there's the city of Issaquah and several other sites that have opportunities for kids. But also you could Google Bellevue volunteer community opportunities. The city of Bellevue has a site with opportunities, but they also have, and I could put this link on my website, they have a list, the handbook that some people put together that lists activities for young people as well, ranging from delivering meals to people or volunteering with a mediation program, etc. I'm sure everybody here can think of a lot of cool volunteer. Oh, College and Career Center has a list of volunteer opportunities. Thank you. Your high school's college and career website is fantastic. It's way better than the school where I worked. It's actually super great. So that's a good. Oh, Victoria, thank you for putting job opportunities in there. Job is an activity. If you work at a paid job, that is an activity, and that may be all the time you have. And maybe that work is to help raise money for your college tuition, or maybe that work is contributing to family income when your parent has been laid off thanks to COVID experiences. That is a very legitimate and worthwhile activity, and that is certainly viewed that way by colleges as well.
I do want to mention one thing about volunteering too, Sally. Just at least at Issaquah High, the PTSA supports a volunteer cord. We give out a graduation cord if they input 100 or more volunteer hours. And they can start anywhere after their 8th grade graduation. So the summer after 8th grade counts, and they just type it into to our website. It's at the bottom of our website, community service hours. But we give out this cord to seniors who turn it in by May 1st of their senior year.
That's great. I thought of 2 small examples of volunteer things. It's hard right now because many of the volunteer things and or jobs that students would do in the summer are not going to be available to them. But I do know that the Issaquah Food Bank I think is accepting volunteers right now. I didn't look at this today, but they have been. And another organization in Seattle, if a student has access to a car, Fair Start, and that's spelled F-A-R-E, Fair Start, which is a pretty amazing organization, is always looking for drivers to deliver meals to Seattle School District students. They may have an age limit for that though, but, and what was the other one? Anyway, oh, good, excellent. Food bank, 16 and 17-year-olds if accompanied by an adult. Thank you.
And Eastside Baby Corner will take people as well. And you can sign up to volunteer on their website. Though right now it might be a little up in the air.
Right, yeah, that's a great organization. So maybe you're shopping for a neighbor who's older, you know, those kind of things can work too. Let's see, any questions?
There was an earlier question. Renee was wondering, she said that the Fisk College book has over 200 colleges. Where do you start? How do you use it?
That is a great question. And I wish I had an audio-visual aid that happens to be down in my office, but it's daunting, right? It's huge. So they do have some terrific indices at the beginning. They have an index by state, so you could start there. They have an index for pre-professionals if a student happened to be interested in business. They have a separate indice for that. So I would look at the indexes. There's one by price point. That's a good index too. And something I did as a parent with the Fisk Guide with my 3 kids, turns out, you know, they didn't love me saying, well, what about this school? What about that school? This is how I know you really shouldn't talk about college too much, because like I made all these mistakes with my kids. And it just got to be too much with my oldest son. He was really tired of me saying that. So what I did, because I couldn't stop myself, is I would look at the Fisk Guide and I'd put a little sticky note on a page where I thought it was an interesting school for him to look at. And I did this with all 3 kids. And so then I'd put the sticky notes in and, you know, leave it laying somewhere. This is when they were juniors or seniors. Don't do this when they're freshmen or sophomores. So that's a way that students can weed the book out a little bit easier, as you do that for them. What they most love to do is look right at me and rip the sticky note off, like, don't love your suggestion. So that did give them some personal teenage satisfaction. What I like about the Fisk Guide, and then I have one other tip there tied with that, is it presents only 2 pages, sometimes 2.5 pages of information about a college. If students try to do this online, which they will, and they're great sites, I've listed some in my resources like Niche and Naviance, and College Board has a search site. Those search sites, I think, often leave students drowning in information. Click, 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 and they just drift away. It's just too much information about too many colleges and too much information about a single college. So while this is daunting to look at this book, the way it's laid out is a shortened form of information. And there is one other tool, I listed this on my resource page, that I really liked. It's called Professor Pathfinder's College Map, and you can buy it on Amazon. It might not be called Professor Pathfinders anymore, but it's a college map, and it's a US map with a little bit of Canada, and it's big. It's like, you know, the size of this window, and it is a map that shows you US and some Canadian colleges. And that can be a starting point for students to look at that map and look at regions and see names of schools. That could be, I mean, it takes a lot of wall space, but I don't know, maybe you put it in your garage or hang it in their bathroom. I'm kidding about that. Don't do that. That's a little bit much. But that tool can be an interesting way to look at things, because maybe kids are thinking, this is what a lot of them think, I want to go to California where it's sunny and life is fun. And okay, so here's the schools you can look at. You know, that can be another tool to narrow it down a little bit. Good question. Victoria asked this question. Wendy, do you want to, just so they have a break from my voice, do you want to read that question?
Sure. Would you encourage families to look at applications like Common App or Coalition App before the senior year, just to see what they ask. Are there pros and cons to this? When should they look? For instance, the Coalition App is open all the time.
It's a good question, Victoria. So on those two application platforms, one of the things I think Victoria is talking about is what are the essay questions that will be available to students to answer. And both of those platforms would have that. You can also Google essay questions, Common App. I have mixed feelings about doing this too far in advance. For many years at my high school and also here at my house, I ran something called College Boot Camp, where kids worked on their college essays. And many, many, many high school students in their junior year, their teachers asked them to write a college essay. And so when I worked with students in August of their senior year, so that's just 3 or 4 months after their junior year has ended and they've written that junior year essay, many of them brought their junior year essay. But what they ended up writing and thinking about in August of their senior year was, in almost all cases, so much more deep and intellectually mature than what they wrote as juniors, because they grow, their minds expand and grow so much in the time, even from the ending of junior year to the beginning of senior year. Just a mind shift happens for a student when graduation is getting a little closer, and they're a little better able to do that introspective thinking, which is required. All of the questions asked on the college platforms really require some deeper intellectual thinking. And I do think that students reading those questions too early has them think about it as if it's a checklist. Oh, question, okay, that's what I'm gonna write about. And then they just stick with that and they don't wait and let the moment of being a rising senior and that intellectual depth that they have then re-inform what they're gonna write. So I'm hesitant about them looking at those questions too far in advance. It's not like they're secret. I do think it's highly likely that the questions will change for certainly rising juniors and possibly rising seniors, because the questions have been the same for about 3 or 4 years now, and they do usually change the questions every 3 or 4 years to kind of a little bit prevent too much plagiarism and a little bit just reinvigorate the admissions officer who's reading 1,000 essays. They just want to read something different. One nuance to add to that, both Common App and the Coalition app offer the option to submit anything you've ever written in response to an essay. And in my opinion, that's rarely been a great piece of writing to submit. So taking a paper you wrote your junior year about, I can't think of a junior year reading book, but let's say Red Badge of Courage or something, and submitting that as your college essay does not let your newly matured intellectual depth come across. So I don't love that option, submit anything you've ever written. A handful of times it works great, but do you think that answered that, Victoria? Oh, she's fast on the typing. Good. Oh, Ronnie, you asked a great question. Can I speak a little bit to early admission versus regular admission? I'm so glad you asked this because I actually had a note about it right here. So startlingly, this morning, breaking news, Princeton announced that they will not have early admissions next year. Like, this is big. So I will talk about regular and early admissions as if it were non-COVID times and the pros and cons, and I do speak to this a good bit in the presentation. But I have always liked early action admissions. That's the non-binding version of an application. I've always liked that for students because I think it got them working on their application and submitting something by the early part of November and got them started off the mark before diddle-daddling all the way until December. So I have always really liked it for that reason. It got students going. As well, getting an early decision, I shouldn't have used that word, getting an early response from a college to your early admission application, whether that response is you're admitted or you're rejected, that is actionable information. So if you are rejected early from a college, that helps you recalibrate. You got to take a few days to let the sting wear off, but then you can say, I better apply some different schools. If I've been rejected from this school I applied to early, I might need to change my list a little bit. I think it's actionable information, and it's really worthwhile doing those early action admissions. Early decision is an entirely different kettle of fish because that is a binding contract. I have very mixed feelings about that. Side note to that, University of Washington's application date, which is November 15th, is pretty darn early anyway. That's regular. That's the only admissions date they offer. So that does really get students off the mark. The one student who might not thrive with an early action application is the student who has had a really rocky junior year from a transcript standpoint, but really was starting to get their sea legs about them towards the end and expects that senior first quarter will be a stronger year for them, a stronger academic quarter. So that student might want to wait and then ask their high school counselor to submit their quarter grades with their application. But that's a pretty, given that one caveat, I really do like early admission for everyone, or early action admission for everyone else. I don't know if Wendy or Victoria has comments. They both have students who've been accepted to college, have gone to college, they have older kids. Anyone else have any different answers there? That's fine too.
No, I agree with what you said about it's good for them to at least do one because it forces them to write essays. Otherwise, they're just procrastinating. Or at least
they are. Yeah, it really does force them to get something done. A lot of students are actually really scared to start. It's not just procrastination, it's fear. They're afraid to start because that means they could get rejected. And they don't have practice with that. And, you know, life's going to have a lot of that for them. And they just need to get started on that work. So I agree. It does get them, it gets them started. And further, it gives them information that isn't their parent or their high school counselor saying, you know, I don't know if you can do that. I mean, I hate high school counselors that say that anyway. My boss went into the high school counseling work because her counselor told her, I think you should consider being a flight attendant instead of going to college. Not that there's anything wrong with being a flight attendant, but she didn't like that she was dismissed so out of hand. But information from a college is a trusted source, whereas parents are not, to be honest. I don't know, we're getting close to the 5 o'clock hour. Does anyone else have questions? I have one funny question I'm just going to ask. Is Julie Manley still, Julie Manley, are you the Julie Manley who taught at Tyee?
Hey, Sally, yes, I taught at Chinook. I thought that, yes, you looked familiar. It sounded familiar.
I know, didn't you? Oh, you were at International for a little bit.
Yes, I was international. Mm-hmm.
And you taught my daughter, Leslie.
Yeah, I'll turn on the camera.
She is now a teacher.
Oh,
so
she is? That's so exciting. Yeah, I was going to private message you the same thing. It's so wonderful to hear you.
I know, I was like, oh, Julie Manley. You were, people thought you were a wonderful teacher. So
I appreciate that. Well, yeah, tell your family hello.
I will. I see a question here for homeschooling kids. What should they keep in mind when they choose courses in high school? That is a tough question and probably a little bit out of my bailiwick. I don't have a lot of experience. I have 2 students that I've worked with who did some level of homeschooling, and it does take to make sure that you are completing all the courses and that your homeschooling experience comes across in a transcript and in an application takes some specific concentration, I guess, in research, a great place to ask that question would be in a college information session. So in the past, these have been in person in a variety of places, but a lot of them are happening online now. I know, for example, the University of Washington is doing online admission sessions right now, and it might be useful to attend, virtually one of those sessions and ask that question of the admissions officer in the session if there's a chat format. But I'm afraid I really don't have a strong experience there enough to answer your question. I'm sorry.
It looks like there's one last question, and then we probably need to wrap up. So you're welcome to stay a little bit longer after this. Can you be a part of an honors program in college if you're doing Running Start?
So I want to make sure I understand this question. There are two recommendations. Good, I do want to touch on teacher recommendations too, but there are two things I think you're asking about. So almost every college has an honors college, and those are, generally speaking, separate applications. Some colleges just invite you after you've been admitted, and there's no prohibition on being admitted to those programs if you're a Running Start student. Running Start grades, especially in Washington state schools, Running Start is a well understood and well-studied program, and colleges in Washington really understand what a Running Start grade means and what a Running Start transcript looks like. That is not as widely true at colleges across the country. So being a Running Start student, for example, and applying to a bunch of East Coast schools, they will not maybe have as in-depth of understanding about what that is. So a student might need to explain that, because it is there are similar programs across the country, but they're not all called Running Start. And again, there's no prohibition on being part of a college's honors program. So I hope that answered that question. Recommendations for students to take the lead for college applications and removing the parent from the process. Man, this is a really, really, really tough question. If I could wave a magic wand, I would have every high school in the country do a session with all their high school seniors and help them build college lists at the high school so that you could take the parent out of the process. Without the parent being part of the process, Issaquah has some good resources on their website. The high school counselors there run some really good information sessions about that. I would look at Mark Moody's Quick and Dirty College List that's linked on my webpage. He has a really great way to rank your colleges in terms of the fit. And I had a couple slides about, there are 4 boxes, the confident school, which is my replacement for the word safety. Hate that word, but confident school, reach, lottery reach, and match schools. You might take those 4 boxes and ask your student to put, let's say, 2 or 3 schools in each of those boxes. And getting the parent out of it is super hard. I know, having had my own 3 kids, one of them I could barely talk about school with her, and the other 2 let me look at their college lists and weigh in a little bit more. So that probably wasn't a very good answer to that question. A lot of kids are not going to take the lead because they're scared, and they're really scared they're not going to get into college. And that's really fundamentally what is often the case for kids who don't start. So I would say to them, apply early, or rolling decision. Washington State University has rolling decision where they do let a student know early. Apply early, just get them started, and I think they'll begin to get their sea legs beneath them. I know we're at 5:02 now, but very quickly, recommendations. So small colleges ask for students to submit teacher recommendations, and thinking about what to do for that question that was, what can 9th and 10th graders do to prepare for the college application process? try to build some relationships with your teachers. Practice asking questions in class. Practice going to office hours and trying to build a little bit of a relationship with a teacher to see if that doesn't fuel your learning a little bit. 9th and 10th grade teachers generally do not write college applications, so you don't need to like brown nose them too much. But practice when you're a 9th and a 10th grader. Maybe pick one teacher you try to develop a relationship with. And actually remote learning has been surprisingly interesting for relationship building with some students who are a little more shy about talking in the classroom. They can build a relationship with a teacher in a remote learning environment they might not have been able to in a class. So I think that's maybe all I have to answer. Is that all the questions?
That is all. Those are all the questions. And if you want to stay a little bit later for just a few minutes, if anyone had anything else, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And I just want to say thank you very much, Sally, for coming today.
Oh, thank you for letting me chat. You know, for us extroverts being in quarantine, I got a chance to chat. No, I'm kidding. I appreciate having worked with Issaquah all these years. I treasure all the kids that I've gotten to know from Issaquah are just, I call them my kids. So appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you. I'll hang out for just a second if anyone else has a question.